Hello guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer, I'm living in Denmark and have specialized in writing fantasy and science fiction stories. Right now I'm going to read chapter 4 from my fantasy story Mandigo and the Hellhounds. Chapter 4. And that's how things turned out. Mandigo would spend his mornings at Gretas, who would teach him to read, write and do arithmetic, both in his own language, called Common, and in Feral, the language of the elves. In addition to that, she taught him how to recognize the various plants out in the nature, and to know which ones could be used as remedies, and which ones ought to be avoided. For a long time now, she had begun to suspect that not only was Mandigo an exceptionally intelligent boy, but he also had certain special gifts. The speed and effortlessness with which he learned to use the sign to ward off the Lord of Shadows had reconfirmed her conviction, and she was now determined to further cultivate that side of him. She not only practiced white magic, but possessed a greater amount of wisdom. Magic powers come from the inside, she told Mandigo. One day, while they were talking about magicians and sorcerers, you either have the gift or you don't. You can do as many incantations, make as many signs and gestures as you want, but they won't do you any good if you don't have the gift. Actually, the best way to spot a truly talented sorcerer from one who isn't is that the talented one will hardly need to make any gestures or say anything at all to get his magic to work. Do I have the gift? Mandigo wanted to know. Greta smiled but did not answer straight away. Instead, she put her arm around Mandigo, grabbed hold of Bellatrix, and took them both out to the woods, where she led them to a great oak tree. She knelt down in the grass on the forest floor where there was a new little oak tree. You have the gift, Mandigo, but it is still like this new little oak tree that is delicate and whose roots aren't fully developed yet. But with time and practice, your gift will be just as great and fully developed as a great oak tree over there, and only then will you be able to use your gift. Do you understand what I mean? Mandigo looked from a new little tree that was barely anything but a twig in the ground with two small leaves on it, to the great oak tree that towered sturdily before him with his massive trunk and his branches reaching towards the sky, and he felt overwhelmed. He turned his face to Greta and looked at her with a practically dejected gaze. Will I really be expected to learn and know that much? Greta chuckled. Magic isn't something that you learn overnight. Just look at me. I learn something new every day. That's how it'll be for you someday too. They walked to Greta's cottage, and Mandigo helped her gather eggs and clear out the dung where the animals were stalled. Bellatrix would either lie or sit close by on a blanket. She grew quickly and was almost always in the company of an animal of some sort. Usually it was a mouse or a rabbit, but sometimes also a small bird or even a fawn. They never harmed her. They would just stay close to her, and she was never afraid of them. She'd chatter merrily away with them, and as though they understood her and she them. She'd often pull the rabbit's ears, and they would willingly put up with her. Mandigo loved the hours he spent with Greta. She and her books showed him that outside of the forest, the village and his father's mill was a much bigger world just waiting to be discovered. It was as though a whole new universe was slowly unfolding before Mandigo, and he soaked it all up like a sponge with a curiosity and hunger that was seemingly unending. He would ask incessantly about even the most trivial things, and though Greta was both a patient and knowledgeable teacher, there were times when she would find herself practically tearing her hair out in sheer frustration of Mandigo's constant questioning. But then she'd just laugh and shrug her shoulders. She was the one who had started it all by teaching Mandigo, and in her heart she was absolutely delighted that she had found such an attentive student. In reality, much of Greta's occasional frustration stemmed from the fact that Mandigo had to return to the village every day at noon to work at the mill. If Mandigo hoped that his father would cut down on his chores at home because she had to help Greta in the mornings, he was in for a grave disappointment. His father didn't even give him time to eat lunch when he had returned, but put him immediately to work. Since Mandigo had to work without getting lunch the first few days, he became extremely tired and somewhat ill. This resulted in, among other things, him tipping over a bucket of corn and losing a bag down into the mill's sensitive machinery so that it stopped working. His father became so furious with him that he gave him an exceptionally hard whipping that left him practically unable to walk the following week. But one thing he did learn was to eat his lunch on his way from Greta's cottage. And anyway, the food at Greta's was much better and considerably more varied, and she always made sure that he got plenty to eat. There was almost always fish that had been caught in the brooks and lakes in the forest, and as well as the berries, roots, salad, dandelion leaves, and various herbs and nuts, cheese, eggs, and sometimes game was eaten. Greta did not hunt herself, but it was not uncommon that people she managed to help with her gifts would pay her in kind or with game they had hunted. Though it was true that, according to law, only Baron Nicholas and his people were allowed to hunt in the forest, the Baron's forest rangers and the local people had, through the years, developed an unspoken agreement that as long as the local people merely caught an allotted number of the smaller game every once in a while and otherwise left the animals alone, no one would complain. Besides, the forest was so big that it was hard for the common man to evaluate exactly where the Baron's borders were located, and exactly whether a pheasant had been caught in a trap on one side of the brook or on the other side of the brook was not always easy to establish if you couldn't even really find the trap itself. Greta may not have gone out to hunt, but she loved to bake, and she almost always had a cake for Mandigo whenever he came to visit her. Sometimes she'd let him help her bake, and they'd stand in the kitchen surrounded by clouds of flour, fumes of spices, sourdough, marmalade, warm milk with clumps of butter and dough stuck on their fingers, while Greta told Mandigo about hemlock, mandrake, root, foxglove, lungwort, nettle soup, the phases of the moon, the winter solstice and autumn equinox, and the moving of the stars across the heavens through the various seasons. And little Bellatrix listened to, with eyes wide open and ears pricked up. 4 winters went by like that. Meanwhile, Mandigo had become a lanky boy with sinewy muscles and shoulder-length nut-brown hair, calloused hands due to all the hard work in his father's mill, and more brains than the entire village put together. And that was not popular, neither with his family nor the village as a whole. As mentioned before, Mandigo had 6 siblings, and it was especially the older of them that had a pronounced jealousy for the special treatment he was given. The oldest of them, Karl, was 22 winters, and as strong and as ox. It had already been agreed that he was to take over the mill and marry the baker's daughter. The marriage was planned for the following spring. One would think that would leave Karl satisfied then, but he wasn't. He thought it was wrong that Mandigo, the youngest of his brothers, already knew more about the alphabet and numbers than he himself did. As inheritor of the mill, he thought it was more entitled to him to the extra education and all the good meals. Karl and Mandigo had never really got along that well with one another, but the more apparent it was that Mandigo had really become quite good at writing and doing arithmetic, the more Karl seemed to resent him. The next oldest sibling was named Hans. Whereas Karl was a proud and broad-shouldered type, Hans took more after his mother. He was a medium tall, dark-haired and gangling youth. He was 19 and, like Karl, would help with the mill, but ever since he turned 17, he had also begun to lend a hand with the vicarage, and there were certain expectations on the part of both families that he soon would propose to the vicar's daughter, so that the two of them could take over the management of the vicar's grounds. Though Hans was not unfriendly towards Mandigo in any direct way, it was clear that it irritated him that he, who worked closely with the vicar, a man who was considered to be extremely learned and knowledgeable, was not allowed to take part in gaining the same intellectual knowledge as the vicar, whereas Mandigo, at any hour of the day it suited him, could go out to the forest and visit Greta to get new inspiration. Hans was also one of the first to tell the vicar about the agreement his father had made with Greta concerning Mandigo. The vicar became quite angry. He was among many who considered Greta to be a witch, and he was seriously concerned about the kind of influence she might have on poor little Mandigo. However, he became strangely silent when the miller told him about the silver he had received every month for letting Mandigo help Greta. The idea was, the miller explained to him in a conspiratorial tone, that the silver would be included in Hans's dowry. After that, there was no more talk about that particular issue. Sigyn was the eldest of Mandigo's 2 sisters. She had just turned 17 and was already promised to the oldest son of a large farmer in a neighboring village. There would still be a year, however, before she'd move in with her future spouse. She was a tall, slim girl with long blonde hair and lavender eyes, which, for some reason or other, had always struck Mandigo as being cold and calculating. In the years where they had known one another, Sigyn had always treated Mandigo with forbearing indifference, except for the time that he, at the age of 6, suddenly got a mania for pulling her hair until she one day slapped him in the face with a frying pan. Rolf was 14 and a half and a regular nuisance to Mandigo, especially when Mandigo was younger. Whereas Karl and Hans were hard-working and simple-minded boys, Rolf was as lazy and sly as a cunning fox. He had a certain talent for avoiding the hardest work and thereby put the blame on Mandigo if something hadn't been done on time. Rolf also had a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't just mere verb conjugations or the art of rhetoric that Mandigo was learning out of Greta's. Like the vicar, he was fairly sure that Greta was also teaching him about magic, and Rolf wanted to have access to that knowledge because he believed that he could use it to his advantage. As a third son of the family, the best he could possibly hope for was to become a farmhand on one of the area's big farms, or perhaps to work at a baron's estate. But he wanted more than that, and he considered it to be doubly unfair that Mandigo, whose future prospects had been even more dismal than his own, now suddenly had access to that knowledge. What was that brat going to use it for? He was perpetually trying to pump Mandigo about the witchcraft he was convinced Greta was teaching him. But Mandigo kept silent. Greta had warned him about telling everything about the secret knowledge she was teaching him. It was all right for him to talk about how he was learning to read and write and do arithmetic, but all the other exciting things he was to keep to himself for his own sake, as she had said. And Mandigo was completely fine with that. The secrets which Greta had shared with him were their special secrets. Mandigo had never really had anyone he could share secrets with before, so the fact that she shared her secrets with him made him feel like something special for the first time in his life. And he had no desire to give that up, much less to someone like Rolf. Peter was 13, as dumb as a shovel. He took after his father both in appearance and mentality, only he had more of a temper. He had a habit of exploding into a near hysterical rage at the slightest adversity, and would often get into trouble with the neighbors and into fights with the other boys of the village. It was little consolation for Mandigo that Peter got almost as many whippings as he did, but apart from that, the two boys had little in common, he felt. At any rate, Peter could be nice enough and a good friend on his good days, but just as often he could be viciously evil and intolerable to be around. The only one of his siblings whom Mandigo felt he had a close relationship with was his little sister, Ragnhild. She was only 7 winters old, but was always hanging on to the hem of his trousers as soon as he came home to the mill. It wasn't because the others didn't treat her well. She was a sort of latecomer and was considered to be the family's little darling. But for some reason she always wanted to be around Mandigo. Perhaps because he was, in fact, the closest one to her own age. She was, however, also an intelligent child, and Mandigo would secretly teach her about numbers and letters. There were others in the village, apart from the vicar, who did not approve of Mandigo's visit to Greta's. There were very few who could understand why a boy like Mandigo, who was known for being helpless and clumsy when it came to practical matters, should work at Greta's, and besides that learn to read and do arithmetic. That was just a real waste of time, most of them thought. Greta must have gone a little nuts in her old age, or else she was planning on doing something that was unnatural and dangerous. There were rumors and stories, but between his lessons with Greta and his chores at home at the mill, Mandigo really didn't have time to listen or worry about them. It was now his 4th year out of Greta's, and his impatience to learn about real magic was beginning to really grow. She herself had told him that he had the gift, but it wasn't fully developed and therefore untested. But if he wasn't given a chance to test it, how could he then develop it? He would have to be patient at first. The harvest was underway, and there was so much to do at the mill that Mandigo had not been able to visit Greta for 3 weeks. Those were the longest 3 weeks of his life. He became grumpy and sulky, and got a whipping all the more often, which, of course, did nothing to improve his mood. There was, however, a difference in how the whippings affected him now as opposed to before. In the past, though he may have clearly felt the pain and degradation of the blows, he would have accepted them as part of his everyday routine, simply because that was all he knew. But now, in the meantime, he had attained knowledge out of greatness, and with a new budding self-awareness. With each blow that he received from his father, he felt wronged on a deeply personal level, and little by little there began to grow within him a violent rage bordering hatred towards his father. The little oak tree had started to grow, and it would soon be needing all its sap and vigor. End of chapter 4.